In the first video for this chapter, we looked at how a firm derives its production function and how the marginal productivity of labor plays into the marginal cost for the firm. Now we're going to look at how much does a firm decide to produce and how does it figure that out, and then what factors will play into how much the firm demands labor. Now first, I want you to think about, in an enormous economy, there are two general kinds of production processes. Now obviously there's lots of specific ones, but in general, economists look at processes in two ways. The first way is a labor-intensive process. This is a process of producing a good or service that relies heavily on people, on labor. Industries like hospitality, meaning hotels and resorts, rely heavily on labor. You can't create hospitality with a machine. Medicine and healthcare rely heavily on labor. Nurses, nurses' aides, orderlies, doctors. The food service industry is similar. You can have a lot of equipment in a kitchen, but ultimately it requires people, and a whole lot of people, to both produce the food and serve the food. Economists then look at a second kind of process, which we call capital intensive. These are processes that rely heavily on machinery, or what economists often call the capital of a business. Now, machinery-intensive or capital-intensive processes and businesses would be involved in, say, steel production or other heavy manufacturing. The process of extracting petroleum and natural gas from the earth is heavily machinery-related, not as much reliant on labor. Now, that's not to say that labor-intensive industries avoid using any machinery. Labor-intensive industries generally still use machinery. They just use more labor than they use capital. And it's the same concept for capital-intensive processes. They still use a certain amount of labor. Now remember, the marginal cost of a firm depends on two factors: the cost of the inputs as well as the productivity of the inputs, how much each of those inputs can actually produce. Thus, the marginal cost of labor is going to be the cost of labor, which is the wage, divided by the marginal product of labor, which is how we calculated the productivity of labor. The marginal product of labor is its productivity. And if you recall in the house cleaning example, the marginal product of labor was 0.2 houses. For every additional hour of labor, we got 0.2 houses cleaned. Now also, don't forget from week 2, we also covered that a firm decides to produce where its marginal revenue, the amount of revenue it gets from producing one more of the good, it produces where that equals the marginal cost. So, looking at it in a graph, what we see is that the firm has a marginal cost curve, right? And it has a marginal revenue curve. And it decides to produce a quantity where those two curves intersect. That's what we call the profit maximizing quantity. Now, obviously, they won't just choose a price where the marginal cost and the marginal revenue are. They will move up to the demand curve that they must deal with. Every firm has a demand curve that faces it. That's the market demand. It will move up to that curve to determine what the profit maximizing price will be. So, just reviewing, a firm chooses the quantity it produces based on where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. The firm chooses the price that it will sell the good based on the market demand curve that faces the firm. So how does it figure out how much labor to demand? Well, the firm chooses the amount of labor by first choosing a level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and then it determines how much labor does it need to produce that level of output. And that's going to be based on the productivity of labor, the marginal product of labor. As the wage decreases, a firm's marginal cost will decrease also, right? Because the total cost of labor is both its productivity and the wage rate. So as the wage rate decreases, the firm's overall marginal cost will decrease, which means its marginal cost curve will shift out or to the right. If marginal cost is decreasing, the firm will choose to produce more output. That new output level, that higher output level that the firm will now be at, places it at a different point of the market demand curve that faces it, which means price will decrease. Let's look at that graphically. We had an original marginal cost curve based on the original wage rate, but then the wage rate decreased. That means marginal cost curve shifts out or to the right, or in this case, because of its shape, it almost looks like it's going down, right? But it's shifting out, which means that the firm will choose to produce at a higher quantity, because that quantity is where the new marginal cost now intersects with the firm's marginal revenue curve. If we follow that line up to the demand curve that faces the firm, we find a new profit maximizing price, which is actually lower than the original price. And that's because wage decreased, marginal cost decreased, output increased, the price falls. Now, let's go back to that labor decision. We just looked at a scenario where the wage decreases, and we said that when the wage decreases, marginal cost decreases, the firm will choose to produce more output. But one thing we didn't say was that, guess what? When the firm produces more output, it's going to demand more labor. Now, in the market for that good, we will see an output level that increases and a price that decreases. But what caused that demand and the change in the demand for labor was a change in the wage rate. We will get to the difference between real wage and nominal wage, but just as a reminder or as a preview, real wage is the wage rate that a firm gives to its workers, the nominal wage, but is divided by the price level in the economy. The real wage shows the effects of the prices in the economy. So what causes a change in the demand for labor? Well, first of all, we just saw that a change in the wage rate will cause a change in the firm's demand for labor. A decrease in the wage rate will cause an increase in demand for labor. An increase in the wage rate will cause a decrease in the demand for labor. Notice it's an inverse relationship. Another thing that causes a change in the demand for labor is the productivity of the labor itself, and we'll look at what happens there. Lastly, what also causes changes in the demand for labor are changes in the overall market demand. Let's look at them a little bit separately. Changes in the wage rate. When the wage increases, generally firms lay workers off. As wage decreases, firms hire more. Now, we said that wage increase, wage decrease causes a change in demand for labor, but why do wages increase or decrease? Well, notwithstanding government action, we'll leave that until Chapter 11. The reasons that wages increase or decrease, assuming the government doesn't intervene, will be because of the labor supply. Well, who supplies labor? That would be the individuals in the economy that want to work. So, two major changes in labor supply will be caused by population growth. So if the population grows, we will see the supply curve shift out or to the right, and that will cause a decrease in the overall wage in the economy. There's more workers. The other thing that can cause a change in labor supply is what we call labor participation. Not everyone in an economy chooses to work. As we see changes in the number of people in the economy that choose to work, we will see a change in the labor supply. Now, labor participation tends to both increase and decrease depending on different societal factors. Your book brought up the concept that about 60 or 70 years ago in the United States, we saw a huge shift in the desire for women to work. As women decided to enter the labor force, we saw a major increase in labor participation, which is like saying there was a greater supply of labor. This tended to have a downward pressure on the wage rate. Now, there were other things affecting the wage rate at the time, and so overall, there wasn't a major decrease in the wage rate, but we will see as labor participation changes, a change in the wage rate. Now let's look at changes in productivity. In general, we measure the productivity of labor by the marginal product of labor, which we've already discussed. How does every individual hour of labor get more productive? Well, generally we say that's when there are increases in capital at the firm, meaning they've provided some better machinery so that each worker in every hour can actually do more work. We also say it happens when the education level of workers changes. So over time, in most economies, what we generally see is that productivity increases. The marginal product of labor increases over time. If the marginal product of labor does increase, we will see marginal cost decreasing. That means for the same wage rate, for every hour of work, we get more product. That would say that the marginal cost is decreasing over time. If this is the case, firms will decide to produce more output. Remember, every time marginal cost decreases, firms decide, because of the movement of the marginal cost curve, to produce more. When they produce more, they demand more labor. So, to sum up, an increase in the productivity of workers will generally create greater demand for those workers. Lastly, changes in market demand for the firm's product will cause a change in the firm's demand for labor. Now, we see both increases and decreases in demand for a product. Just looking at the potential for an increase of demand, let's say the market demand increases for the firm's product. Well, then we'll see the market demand curve move outwards to the right. This will cause the firm to see its marginal revenue curve shift out or to the right. Well, every time the marginal revenue curve changes, that changes where the marginal revenue curve crosses with the marginal cost curve. And so the firm will produce more output because of the increase in demand in the market. Thus, it will demand more labor. Expect the opposite to happen if market demand decreases. Now, this is just a graph to show us what that looks like on the curve. Notice, we had the old marginal revenue intersected with marginal cost right there, but because of an increase in the market demand curve, we have a new marginal revenue and it intersects with the marginal cost curve right there. Both of those that shift in marginal revenue occurred because the demand curve facing the firm has shifted out also. Every time the demand curve facing the firm shifts out, we expect the marginal revenue curve to shift out. We decide to produce more, and because the firm decides to produce more, it will want more labor. Let's move on to how a firm thinks about entering or exiting a market, perhaps because of the labor conditions that it faces. So we're going to look at a couple different learning objectives right now. We're going to look at the difference between a fixed cost and a variable cost. We're going to look at what factors determine if a firm should remain in business. And we are just going to briefly touch on the concept of a sunk cost, which we have encountered earlier in the textbook. Now, intuitively, you probably know the difference between a fixed cost and a variable cost. Fixed costs are often referred to as a firm's overhead. They're the things the firm has to pay whether or not it produces a single good or not. Things like rent. Things like it may have to pay property taxes. It may have to pay insurance. Well, whether or not it's producing at all, it has fixed costs. The variable costs, you probably also intuitively understand. These are the things, the costs, that change depending on the level of output of the firm. So the raw material cost, the direct labor costs, those all change based on the firm's output. Now, we see here an example of a company that has $14,000 of fixed costs, no matter whether it produces 0 or 2,400 items. It has $14,000 of fixed costs. But you notice that the variable costs are based on this cost function right over here. For every item that it produces, there is $10 of variable cost. And we see that increasing as the firm increases its production. That means, notice fixed costs do not increase or decrease. They stay the same. Variable costs increase as output increases. Thus, total costs overall, because they are made up of both variable and fixed costs, will increase as the firm increases production. Looking at it graphically, fixed costs never change, always the same, no matter what the quantity of output. Variable costs, based on our cost function, they were always $10 per additional item, thus the variable costs increased at a constant rate based on the quantity. Total costs increased at the same rate as the variable cost, but we also have to add in the amount of fixed costs. So total costs are always more than the variable cost, but they increase at the same rate. Now, your book gave you an example of a local small clothing retailer that sells jeans. And the book said, let's analyze that company's or that firm's potential profits based on total costs and fixed costs and variable costs before a Walmart moves into town versus after Walmart decides to move to town. Now, first we have to remember the profit function. Profit function is always total revenues minus total costs. Now, if total costs are made up of both variable costs and fixed costs, then total revenues minus variable costs minus fixed costs should get us profit. All right, right here, table 9.4 in your book shows you the company's potential profits based on variable costs and fixed costs and potential revenues before the Walmart comes to town. And if you notice, up until they decide to sell at least 1,000 pairs of jeans at $25 per jean. By the way, this price is not up to the firm. This is based on the demand curve facing the firm. If they choose to produce 1,000 pairs of jeans or sell 1,000 pairs of jeans at $25 per pair of jean, they can finally cover all of the variable costs associated with selling pairs of jeans, as well as the total fixed cost, which was $14,000. They can have profit of $1,000. As they sell more at decreasing prices, they can still be profitable based on the variable cost and the fixed costs that were associated with their company. Now Walmart comes to town. There's another place to shop for jeans in town. That means that the market demand curve that had been facing the firm has shifted. It has shifted inwards. So for every quantity, the firm, the local small clothing retailer, cannot charge the same high price. In order, for instance, whereas before it could sell 200 pairs of jeans at $29 a pop, now it can only sell 200 pairs of jeans at $25 a pop. Based on its variable costs and its fixed costs, notice this. There is no output level at which the firm can cover all of its variable costs and all of its fixed costs at the price levels that the market now demands. If this is the case, would the small clothing retailer, the local guy, decide to stay in business? Well, it seems like it probably wouldn't, because there's no level at which it can sell that it can be profitable. Now, that's making a really quick, short-term decision, and your book gives you a slightly more complicated way to think about the exit decision. And this is the way it talks about it. It says, well, listen, the firm will decide to stay in business up until the point that the discounted present value of expected future profits is less than the value of its recoverable assets. Now, what are recoverable assets? That's just the amount of money that the firm can get if it sells whatever its fixed assets are. You got a clothing retail store, well, it has a cash register it can sell, it's got hangers it can sell, it's got clothing racks it can sell. So based on that, whatever that amount of money is, the firm will stay in business up until the point that it thinks expected future profits will definitely be less than the amount of money it can get for just selling all of its fixed assets. Now, how does a firm figure out the value of its expected future profits? Well, It's going to look at those different profit scenarios. Remember, in the slide just before this, we said, say the firm was selling jeans at $18 before, it could make $5,200 in profit, right? But if it sells at $18 now, it loses $1,200 in profit. Well, let's look at something like that, and it can say, hey, listen, we think there's a 75% chance that we are probably going to end up losing $1,200 just to try to stay in business. But there's a 25% chance, perhaps, that we can make $6,000 in profit. We think maybe after the customers are shopping at Walmart for a while, they're going to get sick of Walmart and they're going to come back to us. And so there's a 25% chance that we can make $6,000 in profit. If I say 25% chance, or 1/4 times that $6,000 profit scenario, and then 75% chance of the negative $1,200 profit, I add those two chances together and I say, right now, the potential for me to make money, I'm looking at a potential profit of about $300. Are my recoverable assets worth more or less than $300? If they're worth more than $300, a little local clothing retailer is going to decide to go out of business. If my recoverable assets are worth less than $300, I might decide to stay in business until I hit a point where I believe that my expected profit is now less than the amount of money I can get out of my recoverable assets. Kind of complicated, since obviously we don't know exactly what are the chances of making these different profit scenarios. We really don't know. A firm will do its best to look into the market, to really think about the potential, to try to evaluate the competition, and it'll come up with an expected profit. There are experts who do this for a living. Now, let's look at it from the perspective of a firm that's trying to decide whether or not it's going to enter the market. Well, it has a very similar kind of calculation. It looks at the discounted present value of expected future profits, again, just like the firm that was already in business. And it says, hey, I will enter this market if my potential future profit that I am weighting based on the different profitability scenarios and their likelihood, if that potential profit is greater than the cost of entering the market, then I'm going to go into business. Now, what are entry costs? Well, your book gave you a few of them. It's the work and the amount of money you have to do to figure out what location to site your store. There are legal fees to setting up a business. You have to purchase the land. You may have to hire a lawyer and a PR firm to help you deal with public opposition, which does happen in the case of Walmart sometimes, and a whole lot of other stores, believe me, You have to pay to design the store. You have to pay a lot of money to construct the store. If you're Walmart or some other firm, you're going to have to change your supply chain. You're going to have to get a warehouse sited close by. You're going to have to make sure your trucks are able to now start delivering to this new location. And then you have to go through the cost of hiring a whole new staff. That's actually not terribly easy. So if all of those fees together, all of those entry costs add up to something less than the potential to make money in the future by entering the market, then a firm will decide to enter the market. This entry decision will play into some other things that we think about as we think about minimum wage later. So keep these things in mind. Let's move on. Let's think about the labor market from the perspective of the worker and the firm. We have to think about, how do firms and workers even figure out how to find each other? What's the matchmaking that goes on? What's the optimal strategy to follow when you're looking for a job? Well, I can try to help you a little bit with that, but there probably isn't a magic bullet for that. How are wages determined in the labor markets? What government policies are impacting job creation and destruction? And finally, what effects does international trade have on job creation and job destruction? Well, the job search process. Let's look at that. It involves the meeting of workers looking for jobs with the firms that actually are looking to fill the vacancies. Now, how do workers know that firms are looking to fill vacancies? Well, you know of different things. There's the monster.com kind of online job sites. There are the classified sections of local newspapers. There is word of mouth. But one way or another, we have to find a way to have the workers who are looking for jobs meet up with the firms that have vacancies. Now, in the internet age, that has certainly gotten easier. Then we have to match those workers with, given their certain characteristics, with the jobs that require those characteristics. Now, this is where there's a lot of tension in the labor markets. Not all workers looking for jobs have the appropriate skills for the jobs that are actually available, and that's something that we're seeing in our economy. There are workers with lots of specialized skills, but there aren't a lot of jobs open that require those skills. And so we see what we call a dislocation in the labor market. And we'll talk more about that later on in our semester. And then lastly, in the job search process, we have to figure out what wage will the workers receive and the firms pay. Let's talk a little more about that wage bargaining process. Now, usually in most jobs in the economy, it operates under that whole take it or leave it offer. If you recall, we covered that in chapters 4 and 6. Workers will get an offer at a certain wage, and they can either decide to take it or leave it. Now, in the process of deciding whether to take it or leave it, they're going to evaluate their opportunity cost. They're going to actually have to look around the rest of the market and say, I've got this offer right here for this amount of money. What likelihood do I have of finding another offer for a better wage? That's the kind of evaluation they're going to have to do. And they're also going to have to look at what we call the reservation wage. That's the lowest wage the worker will accept in order to sell his labor in the labor market. Now, wages can also be determined based on an actual bargaining process. Firms will be willing to hire at a wage that is at or less than the marginal product of labor. Because remember, the firm's profit will be directly affected by the marginal product of labor versus the wage rate of labor. So firms will hire if the wage rate is less than the marginal product of that worker's labor. The worker will choose a job if the wage rate is greater than his reservation wage, greater than his absolute bare bones minimum wage. Looking at it graphically, we see this. From the firm's perspective, they will pay a wage anything less than that worker's marginal product of labor. The worker will take a wage that is anything more than his reservation wage. If we kind of connect these two, we see that it's right in here where the wage will be set. Now your book did tell you a few things about how to optimally determine this wage. Let's say the worker knows exactly what his marginal product of labor is. Well, he's going to bargain for a wage rate that is just under the marginal product of labor for his labor. On the other hand, let's say the firm knows exactly what the worker's reservation wage is. Well, they are not going to take anything that is a whole lot higher than that reservation wage. So sometimes the bargaining does depend on how much information each side really knows about the other. Lastly, let's look at government policies. Jobs really matter to governments. Every election time, we notice just how much they matter. Voters aren't happy when they're not working, and even in nations where the government is not actually elected, they know that workers wreak havoc if they aren't working enough. Too many unemployed people who actually want to be working is a bad recipe for political stability. So, the government sets policies sometimes. It intervenes in the labor markets to try to keep workers working. For instance, they may have rules or high costs, high taxes involved with closing a plant in the local economy. Okay, well, that sounds all well and good. That makes plants stay open, perhaps, makes them keep employing workers. But even if the plants decide to stay open and they don't decide to close because they are having to pay wages in an economy that they didn't want to actually work in, one of the things economists have noticed is that there will be fewer firms who want to enter those markets if they realize how hard it is to exit when their profitability decreases. This means even if plant closure restrictions do not cause an immediate destruction of jobs, it will ultimately decrease the amount of new jobs that are created in the future. Governments also like to promote small businesses. They'll say, there's lots of small businesses, which means they employ a lot of workers. Well, that's true and it's not true depending on how you look at it. Large firms, at least in the U.S. economy, account for most of the jobs. If that's the case, promoting small businesses, allowing them tax advantages that larger firms don't have, doesn't necessarily have a huge effect on the overall employment in the economy. Lastly, we're going to look at trade policy. Opening up to trade means a government or an economy decides to trade with other economies. Now, this is awesome for jobs in those industries that produce export goods. I'm sorry, there we go. We've landed on the slide. It's not so good for those jobs in industries that are displaced by the imports that will come into the economy because of opening to trade. Now, in general, we noticed back in an earlier chapter that trade tends to be good for the overall price level in an economy. The most efficient producers, based on their comparative advantage, will produce goods which will cause a decrease in the price for both goods because of the decrease in cost for both goods. This means that when an economy opens to trade, we generally see a lower price level. But some jobs will be created and other jobs will be destroyed. So what's the net effect? Well, that will depend on the economy. In the PowerPoint that you find online, you will see more of the key terms that were in this chapter, as well as some of the key concepts. Please look them over to help your understanding.